All right, Brainiacs, welcome to episode 4 of Monday Muscle Madness. And today we're going to dive into some of the science and the appropriate rep range to put on muscle. This has been a huge opinionated debate. I know I've had my opinions that date back the last 18 years that have recently changed because of some of the research that I'm going to be going out with you. And there is a very good amount of research on this topic. So bro, how many reps should I be doing to increase muscle mass? So we first want to look at the constructs and the two types of hypertrophy. So whenever I say muscle growth or increased muscle mass, it's hypertrophy. Okay, that's what the Brainiacs would call those things, is hypertrophy or hypertrophy, however you want to pronounce it. So there's two different types of hypertrophy. The one is sarcomeric hypertrophy. Okay, sarcomeric hypertrophy is about 20% of total muscle volume, and it's what you consider to be the muscle itself. Like when you eat a steak, you're biting into the actual tissue itself. Okay. However, if you boil that steak down, you would find out that it's about 80% water. So 80% of our muscles are made up of water, and that is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Okay, so the water within the muscle would be your sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and the actual tissue itself would be sarcomeric hypertrophy. Okay, so I'll put a little slide up there on our trusty whiteboards because we're probably going to go back to this. I think when most people, when they think of putting on muscle or increasing muscle size, they're thinking of actual tissue, like the actual tissue that you can physically touch and not water. So it's important to understand that 80% of our muscles are filled with water. They're like big water balloons. All right, second, we're going to talk about muscle fiber types. Okay, we have 3 principal muscle fiber types. Some of the literature has up to 4, some of the literature just says 2, but more widely known in your textbooks, you're going to see 3 different muscle fiber types. Type 1 muscle fibers are characterized by a low glycogen content, very high resistance to fatigue. They're built for endurance. They have a high capillary density. They're also the smallest of the 3 muscle fibers. So if genetically I have a lot of type 1 muscle fibers, then I've kind of hit the bad part of the genetic stick as far as putting on muscle, just because they tend to be small. Then you have your type 2B muscle fibers, okay? Your type 2B muscle fibers have a high glycogen content, low capillary density, low respiration, and they are the largest of the 3 muscle fibers, okay? So those are your type 2B muscle fibers, 2B muscle fibers. Then you have your type 2A. Basically with your 2A, your type 1 and your type 2B got together, got married, had a kid, and that would be your type 2A. So they have type 2A muscle fibers have a characteristics of the 2. All right, so here is a little slide to help you recap the different muscle fiber types. Now, on the subject of putting on muscle, which is what we're discussing today, if you genetically have a higher percentage of type 2B muscle fibers, and you're in sports, you're probably going to be pretty jacked. Okay, so if you look at athletes like gymnasts, sprinters, and Olympic lifters, they genetically, the reason that they're world-class athletes is they were born with a very high percentage of type 2B muscle fibers, and therefore when you look at them, they look very jacked. They have a higher than average muscle mass because of their high percentage of type 2B muscle fibers. And it's interesting that all 3 of these athletes are not training for hypertrophy. As a matter of fact, added muscle mass would actually deter them from excelling at their sport. So they have this added muscle mass and this hypertrophy just as a byproduct of the fact that they have a lot of type 2B muscle fibers, and their training stimulates those 2B muscle fibers. Okay, if we look on the other side of the genetic stick, if you're born with a lot of type 1 muscle fibers, like say a cyclist, a triathlete, or a marathon runner, you're going to historically have a lot of high volume training that you're built for, and you're not going to look the most muscular because you have those type 1 fibers, which we mentioned earlier, are the smallest of the 3 muscle fibers, okay? So important to note that. So I want to bring it back to, so far, the way that I used to think the best way to train for hypertrophy is to really hyper-focus on those type 2B muscle fibers. They have the greatest propensity for growth. They're the largest muscle fibers, so let's focus on them. And the type of training that would focus on them would be 3 to 5 reps, typical strength training, very heavy weight, lower volume, maybe a little bit higher on the intensity, okay? So let's look at what the research says on that. Is that the best way to train to put on muscle mass? Well, if we look at rep speed, volume, tension, and hormones, there's 2 scientists that did some really good studies on rep ranges and on athletes who focus on those type 2B muscle fibers. The first was done in 1998, Dr. Hakim, and his studies was done on Olympic weightlifters. So Olympic weightlifters have very type 2B type training. It's very explosive, it's very quick, it's powerful, that's what they're training for. And he found that although they did have good sarcomeric hypertrophy, overall their hypertrophy was average. It really wasn't any better than that of other athletes as a result of their training. So they kind of had some hypertrophy, but it was moderate at best. But the way they were training was all for those type 2B muscle fibers. Dr. Kramer et al. Demonstrated that a higher testosterone response was elicited in the 8 to 12 rep range to failure as opposed to the 1 to 3 rep range, okay? So that's pretty interesting as well. So when we kind of take and put all of this together, what is the optimal rep range for hypertrophy? What gives you the best hormonal response? What gives you the best, yes, the type 2B muscle fibers are important, okay? And you also want to look at what gives you the best overall value. Well, the research is showing that the 2 most important factors in increasing muscle size is going to be the total training volume, number 1, and the hormonal response of that training, number 2. Okay, so type 2B muscle fiber activation and involvement, they found you get enough of that in that 8 to 12 rep range than if you just exclusively focused on your type 2B muscle fibers in that 1 to 3 rep range. So on the other side of the coin, a big mistake that I see a lot of physique athletes or people that are aspiring to get a lot of muscle mass, the mistake they make is they look past the research and they train in that high volume. They do a lot of volume, they train in the 8 to 12 rep range, however, they don't have the intensity that's needed. In other words, they stop at 12 reps or 8 reps or wherever they're stopping when they have 4 or 5 more in them. You're not gonna get the hormonal response if you do that. And the second thing is I just gave you the top 2 for hypertrophy. A close third is the type 2B muscle fibers. So I see a lot of bodybuilders and people who are looking to increase muscle hypertrophy ignore the type 2B muscle fibers and ignore those lower rep ranges altogether. So you definitely want to get into the lower volume or the higher weight, strength rep range of 3 to 5. Don't leave that out of your training. You're gonna be doing yourself a disservice if you do. However, your bread and butter is gonna be that 8 to 12. The reason for that is only 20% of your muscle tissue is actual tissue, which the heavier training shows to increase. The rest, the 80%, is that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Okay, so you don't necessarily want to focus on the 20%. You want to focus on the 80%, while still giving the 20% some love. Okay, so very important that that we understand that. And then we already spoke to training volume, and we already spoke to the hormonal response. As far as my old thought of saying, hey, you really want to focus on the type 2B muscle fibers, there is good truth to that because they do have the greatest propensity for growth, but unless you're part of the genetic elite, you probably have an even amount of muscle fibers. So meaning you have 1/3 type 2B, 1/3 type 2A, and 1/3 type 1. Okay, well, the type 2A and type 1 are going to respond. 2A is going to respond best to 8 to 12 reps. Type 1 is going to respond best to 15 plus reps. And yes, while type 2B is going to respond really well to 3 to 5 reps, 66% of your muscle fibers are going to respond to those higher rep ranges, the 8 to 12 or plus rep ranges. Only 33%, if you have an even amount of the 3 rep ranges, is going to respond to the heavier training. Now again, if you're part of the genetic elite, you can flip-flop that around a little bit, but the genetic elite, we're talking about the top 1% in the world. All right? So the bottom line to answer the question is yes, training volume under the right intensity. So we're talking about 65 to 75%. 75 is a little high. I would say 65 to 70% of 1 rep max in that 8 to 12 rep range. Going to MMF, momentary muscular favor, is going to be where your bread and butter is. But don't make the mistake of completely ignoring your type 2B muscle fibers. Show them some love. Get out into the 3 to 5 rep range, the heavier rep range. Get underneath some heavy iron. There's going to be benefits to that. The best program all around, I think holistically, would be to do a set that simulates your type 2B muscle fibers, so that 3 to 5 rep range, 85% of max. Then do some training in that 8 to 12 rep range, maybe your next exercise, okay? So in that 8 to 12 rep range for the type 2A muscle fibers, and then add some training in that 15 plus rep range, slower movement speeds on those reps for those type 1 muscle fibers. All right, so hopefully that brought some continuity and some clarity to the rep ranges and some of the science behind that. We look forward to seeing you next Monday for Monday Muscle Madness.